There exists a timeless principle in the realm of imperial power that Washington appears to have entirely disregarded. One cannot appropriate a nation's wealth and label it freedom. One cannot abduct a head of state and call it justice. And one cannot strike a sovereign territory and anticipate global praise for moral righteousness. What America just executed in Venezuela was not a triumph. It was an admission that the American empire has reached such a state of desperation that it must abandon every pretense of the rules-based system it spent 8 decades constructing. On January 3, 2026, at roughly 2 a.m. local time, the heavens above Caracas ignited. Over 150 American military aircraft roared through Venezuelan airspace. Detonations shook the capital. The city's lights wavered and went dark as American troops demonstrated what Trump would later describe as a particular expertise we possess in neutralizing essential infrastructure. Within half an hour, a ground unit extracted Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro and his spouse from their fortified residence inside Fuerte Tuna, the nation's most significant military installation. By sunrise, Maduro was aboard the USS Iwo Jima, en route to New York to answer charges of narco-terrorism. President Trump appeared before the cameras at Mar-a-Lago, proclaiming it one of the most remarkable, efficient, and formidable demonstrations of American military strength and assurance in American history. He declared that the United States would administer the country until further notice. But here is what Trump neglected to mention. Here is what American media outlets conveniently overlooked. Merely hours before that assault, Maduro had been seated across from Chu Shaoli, China's special representative for Latin American affairs. They were reinforcing their strategic alliance. They were discussing petroleum exports. They were constructing what Maduro termed a multipolar world of progress and harmony. The timing was deliberate. It was a signal. And that signal was not transmitted by Washington. It was transmitted to Washington. Because what transpired in Venezuela is not merely a military action. It represents the ultimate dissolution of the post-World War II framework. It marks the moment when the United States proclaimed to the world that international law is discretionary, that sovereignty is subject to negotiation, and that any nation possessing resources America desires should begin watching their backs. Yet in making this proclamation, Washington has delivered China its most significant diplomatic triumph in the Western Hemisphere. They have substantiated every argument Beijing has ever presented regarding American double standards, and they have hastened the deterioration of the very financial architecture that sustains the American economy. Today, we will examine what truly occurred in Venezuela. We will reveal the petroleum-driven calculations behind this military venture. We will analyze how China positioned itself to profit regardless of the result. And we will clarify why this tactical success may ultimately be recalled as the strategic error that fractured America's influence over the global South. To comprehend why this matters, you must first grasp what Venezuela actually signifies on the global strategic board. Set aside the politics momentarily. Forget Maduro. Forget the allegations of narcotics trafficking and electoral manipulation. Examine the geology. Venezuela sits atop approximately 303 billion barrels of verified oil reserves. According to OPEC's 2025 annual statistical report, this makes it the largest petroleum deposit on the planet, greater than Saudi Arabia's 267 billion barrels, greater than Iran, Canada, and Iraq combined. Nearly 18% of all petroleum on Earth rests beneath Venezuelan territory. The majority of this oil is concentrated in a zone called the Orinoco Belt, an enormous formation extending 600 kilometers across the country's central interior. The United States Geological Survey calculates this single region could hold up to 1.4 trillion barrels of heavy crude in total deposits. Even cautious projections place the extractable reserves at nearly 400 billion barrels. Now here is the essential detail that transforms everything. Venezuelan oil differs from Saudi Arabian oil. It is not the light, sweet crude that flows readily and refines inexpensively. Venezuela produces heavy, sour crude. It is dense, thick, and laden with sulfur. It demands specialized refineries to process. It requires costly infrastructure to extract, and crucially, it necessitates specific machinery that exists in only a handful of locations worldwide. The enormous refineries along the American Gulf Coast were constructed 50 years ago precisely to process this variety of heavy crude. When the United States speaks of energy independence, they conveniently omit this detail. Yes, America extracts a substantial quantity of oil from its shale formations, but that oil is light, sweet crude. The American industrial apparatus, the refineries that manufacture diesel and aviation fuel, and the critical lubricants of contemporary logistics, was engineered to operate on the thick sludge from the Orinoco. For generations, this established a perfect interdependence. Venezuela extracted, America refined, everyone prospered. But then came Hugo Chavez, then came the nationalizations, then came the sanctions, and then came China. The connection between Beijing and Caracas is not a recent phenomenon. It did not materialize as a reaction to American pressure. It was deliberately cultivated over 2 decades as part of China's comprehensive strategy to secure resource access throughout the global South. In 2001, Venezuela became the first Hispanic nation to sign a strategic development agreement with China. That was 25 years ago. Since then, the relationship has progressed through several stages from strategic partnership to comprehensive strategic partnership, and ultimately to what both nations now designate an all-weather strategic partnership. What does that partnership represent in tangible terms? According to information compiled by the Council on Foreign Relations, China has provided nearly $60 billion in state loans to Venezuela since 2005. That is approximately double the amount China has lent to any other Latin American country. Most of these loans were organized as oil for financing arrangements. Venezuela obtained the capital it urgently required. China secured guaranteed oil deliveries and established a presence in America's sphere of influence. The China Development Bank and the Export-Import Bank of China became Venezuela's principal creditors when Western institutions closed their doors. They financed infrastructure initiatives. They constructed railways. They built telecommunications networks. They essentially assumed the function that American capital once performed in the region. But the investment was never solely about finances. It was about strategic positioning. China National Petroleum Corporation, the state-owned energy giant, created joint ventures with Venezuela's national oil company, PDVSA. The most notable of these, Petrosinovensa, was established in 2008 to develop the extra-heavy crude deposits of the Orinoco Belt. This was not a minor arrangement. This was China obtaining direct access to the largest oil reserves on Earth. According to recent analysis, roughly 85% of Venezuela's total crude production now heads to Chinese refineries. China constructed specialized facilities capable of processing the heavy, sulfurous Venezuelan oil that other nations could not handle efficiently. They created the infrastructure. They trained the workforce. They made themselves essential. Then in May 2024, China and Venezuela signed an investment protection and promotion agreement. This received minimal coverage in Western media, yet it was a consequential development. It established a formal legal framework safeguarding Chinese companies operating in Venezuela, ensuring their assets would be protected regardless of political shifts. Beijing was preparing for precisely the scenario that just materialized. When American forces seized Maduro, they entered a country where China has established profound commercial foundations. They captured a leader who hours earlier was conferring with Chinese diplomats about expanded cooperation. And they generated a crisis that, regardless of its resolution, serves Beijing's strategic objectives. Consider the immediate consequences. China's foreign ministry released a statement characterizing the operation as deeply alarming and the flagrant deployment of force against a sovereign state. Foreign Ministry spokesman Lin Jian called it a breach of international law, the UN Charter, and fundamental norms governing relations between nations. China demanded the immediate release of Maduro and his wife. But look beyond the diplomatic rhetoric. Listen to what China did not express. Beijing did not threaten military response. They did not announce economic penalties. They did not recall their ambassador or break diplomatic relations. Instead, Chinese officials emphasized their intention to maintain constructive communication and cooperation with whoever ultimately governs Venezuela. They clarified their commitment to oil exports would remain unchanged regardless of how the situation develops. This is not weakness. This is strategic patience. China comprehends something that Washington evidently does not. You do not need to control the government to control the resources. You need to control the infrastructure, the shipping routes, the refining capacity, and the financial relationships that make resource extraction lucrative. According to analysts at the Economist Intelligence Unit, China is positioning itself to safeguard its investments regardless of who occupies Caracas. The billions of dollars in infrastructure they have constructed over 2 decades does not vanish with a regime change. The joint ventures remain functional. The debt obligations persist. The commercial relationships with Venezuelan businesses and military officials continue. Meanwhile, the United States is now burdened with managing a nation of 30 million people with no evident exit strategy. They have removed Maduro, but his entire governmental apparatus remains intact. Vice President Delcy Rodriguez has assumed the presidency. Defense Minister Vladimir Pedrino Lopez still commands the armed forces. The machinery of the state has not disintegrated. It has merely lost its figurehead. Trump suggested the U.S. would administer the country for an indefinite duration. But what does that actually entail? It means accountability for an economy that has shrunk by 75% over the past decade. It means overseeing a nation where hyperinflation decimated the currency. It means delivering electricity, potable water, and basic services to a population that has witnessed 6 million of its citizens flee overseas. China gets to observe this unfold from a comfortable distance, extending assistance, preserving relationships, and awaiting the inevitable moment when Washington realizes that occupying a country is considerably more costly than invading one. The international response to the Venezuela operation reveals something profound about where America currently stands in the global order. The coalition that condemned this action was not confined to the usual critics. It was not merely Russia and China and Iran. It included some of Washington's nearest regional partners. Brazil, the largest economy in Latin America, and a nation led by President Lula da Silva, issued one of the most forceful denunciations. Lula characterized the operation as an unacceptable boundary that had been crossed. He cautioned it represented the initial step toward a world of violence, disorder, and instability where the law of the strongest prevails over multilateralism. He referenced the darkest moments of interference in Latin American history, an allusion to the brutal U.S.-backed authoritarian regimes that terrorized the continent during the Cold War. Mexico's President Claudia Sheinbaum was equally forthright. She stated that the strikes violated the UN Charter and demanded an immediate cessation of all acts of aggression. At a January 5th press conference, she delivered a phrase that will resonate through history. The history of Latin America is clear and conclusive. Intervention has never produced democracy. Colombia's President Gustavo Petro termed it aggression against the sovereignty of Venezuela and of Latin America. Chile's outgoing President Gabriel Boric condemned what he characterized as a violation of an essential pillar of international law. These are not adversarial nations. These are democracies. These are countries that engage in substantial trade with the United States. These are leaders who decline to recognize Maduro's disputed 2024 election victory. Yet they united in condemnation of American action. On January 4th, Brazil, Spain, Chile, Colombia, Mexico, and Uruguay issued a joint declaration expressing profound concern and firm rejection of the military actions conducted unilaterally in Venezuelan territory. They described Latin America as a zone of peace and cautioned against any intention for governmental control, administration, or foreign appropriation of natural or strategic resources. That final phrase is crucial. They were not defending Maduro. They were warning Washington that seizing Venezuela's oil would be recognized for what it represents: imperial plunder dressed in the language of liberation. The United Nations Security Council convened on January 5th at the request of China, Colombia, and Russia. Venezuela's representative delivered a statement that articulated the stakes clearly. Today, it is not only Venezuela's sovereignty that is at stake. The credibility of international law, the authority of this organization, and the validity of the principle that no state can establish itself as judge, party, and enforcer of the world order are also at stake. Jeffrey Sachs, the Columbia University economist who addressed the council, reached the core of the issue. The matter at stake today is not Venezuela's character. The matter is whether any member state, through force, coercion, or economic strangulation, possesses the right to determine Venezuela's political future or to exercise control over its affairs. The response the world is providing with near unanimity is no, and that unanimity itself represents a victory for Beijing. For years, China has positioned itself as an alternative to American-led institutions. Through BRICS, through the Belt and Road Initiative, through the New Development Bank and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, Beijing has been constructing parallel systems that diminish dependence on the dollar-dominated financial architecture Washington controls. The Venezuelan crisis has provided China the most compelling validation of this strategy conceivable. Every speech Xi Jinping has ever delivered about American hegemony, every warning Chinese diplomats have issued about the weaponization of finance, every argument Beijing has advanced about the necessity for a multipolar world, all of it has just been substantiated in the most dramatic manner possible. The statistics on de-dollarization tell a story that should alarm American policymakers. According to IMF data, the dollar's portion of global foreign exchange reserves has declined to 58%, the lowest level since the turn of the millennium. Central banks worldwide added over 1,000 metric tons of gold to their reserves in 2024, the third consecutive year of substantial purchases as nations pursue alternatives to dollar-denominated assets. China and Russia now conduct the majority of their bilateral trade in yuan and rubles, bypassing the dollar entirely. Brazil and China signed a yuan-real trade settlement agreement. India is acquiring Russian oil in rupees. And perhaps most significantly, Saudi Arabia, the kingdom whose 1974 petrodollar agreement created the architecture of American financial supremacy, has begun accepting yuan for oil sales. The addition of Saudi Arabia, Iran, the UAE, and other major oil producers to the BRICS framework means that the bloc now includes nations responsible for approximately 40% of global petroleum output. If these nations increasingly price their oil in currencies other than dollars, the artificial demand that has sustained American financial dominance begins to dissipate. And what has the United States just demonstrated to every one of these nations? That if you defy Washington, if you dare to price your resources outside the dollar system, American forces might appear in the middle of the night to drag you from your bed. Saudi Arabia is observing. The UAE is observing. Every resource-rich nation in Africa and Asia is observing. And they are all reaching the identical conclusion. Holding dollar assets is now a vulnerability, not an advantage. American security guarantees are conditional on compliance, and the only protection from American power is to construct systems that function outside American reach. China's cross-border interbank payment system now connects 4,800 banks across 185 countries. The mBridge project, a central bank digital currency platform involving China, Hong Kong, Saudi Arabia, Thailand, and the UAE, enables immediate settlement in local currencies without touching the American financial system. These are the escape routes that the Global South is rapidly constructing. The Venezuela operation did not impede this exodus. It accelerated it. The tactical excellence of the military operation itself cannot be disputed. American forces suppressed Venezuelan air defenses consisting of 53 long and medium-range systems, dozens of short-range missiles, and over 440 anti-aircraft guns. They neutralized ground forces numbering 93,000 troops. They extracted Maduro in under 30 minutes of ground time. Only 7 American service members were injured. It was a technical masterwork. But military proficiency is not equivalent to strategic wisdom. The United States has demonstrated it can apprehend any leader, anywhere, at any moment. It has proven its supremacy in kinetic warfare is unmatched. but it has also proven that it no longer respects international law, sovereign equality, or the careful diplomatic architecture that prevented great power competition from descending into chaos for 80 years. The precedent has been set. A powerful nation can now charge a foreign leader with criminal offenses, assemble military forces in the region under the guise of counter-narcotics operations, and then launch a comprehensive assault to capture that leader for prosecution in domestic courts. Every norm has been demolished, every boundary has been transgressed, and every nation with resources America desires is now posing the obvious question: are we next? China does not need to vocalize this. They simply need to remain the alternative. They need to continue extending loans without political stipulations. They need to maintain investments regardless of who governs. They need to demonstrate that partnership with Beijing does not come with the threat of midnight raids and regime change. The irony is almost too perfect to articulate. The United States launched this operation to secure access to Venezuela's oil and counteract Chinese influence in the Western Hemisphere. The outcome will be to confirm every suspicion about American intentions and accelerate the very realignment Washington sought to prevent. Trump told Fox News the operation was partly driven by claims that Venezuela had stolen oil from American corporations during the nationalizations of 2006 and 2007. He demanded Venezuela be compelled to repay what he described as confiscated infrastructure. He spoke openly about American companies reconstructing Venezuela's crippled oil industry. The magnitude of that industry's collapse is staggering. At its zenith in the late 1990s, Venezuela was producing 3.5 million barrels of oil per day. By 2025, that figure had plummeted to roughly 960,000 barrels. Decades of underinvestment, corruption, brain drain, and the cumulative effect of American sanctions have left the infrastructure in ruins. Estimates suggest it would require $180 billion in investment over the next 15 years merely to restore production to its former levels. Even maintaining current output would require $50 billion. The refineries are aging. The equipment is deteriorating. The skilled workers have departed. American oil majors are unlikely to commit the capital necessary for this reconstruction without extraordinary assurances. They possess long memories. They recall the nationalizations. They recall the seizures. And they understand that any investment they make could be eliminated by the next government that decides to reclaim sovereign control over national resources. Meanwhile, China has already established the relationships, the infrastructure, and the institutional knowledge to operate in Venezuela's challenging environment. Chinese companies did not depart during the sanctions. They adapted. They discovered workarounds. They exhibited the patience that American corporations, pressured by quarterly earnings reports and shareholder expectations, simply cannot sustain. The most probable outcome is not an American renaissance in Venezuelan oil. It is continued reliance on Chinese expertise and Chinese capital, regardless of who occupies the presidential palace. As I compose this, Nicolás Maduro sits in a federal detention facility in New York, awaiting trial on charges that carry potential life sentences. His wife remains in custody alongside him. The government he led for 13 years continues to function under Vice President Delcy Rodriguez, whom Trump characterized as essentially willing to do what we think is necessary. But the Venezuelan military remains intact. The intelligence services remain operational. The Chavista political structure that has dominated the nation for a quarter century has not been dismantled. It has simply lost its most prominent figure. International law experts have been unequivocal in their assessment. Jeffrey Robertson, one of the world's foremost human rights lawyers, stated the strike was contrary to Article 2 of the UN Charter and qualifies as a crime of aggression under international law. Professor Elvira Dominguez Redondo of Kingston University noted there was no evidence whatsoever to support claims of self-defense or UN Security Council authorization that would make the operation legal. The UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres expressed deep alarm and warned of potential worrying implications for the region. His spokesperson stated clearly that the rules of international law have not been respected. But international law only matters if it is enforced. And who enforces international law against the nation that controls the enforcement mechanisms? This is the question China has been posing for years. This is the question the Global South is now answering by constructing parallel institutions and alternative systems that do not depend on American goodwill. The lessons of Venezuela will be examined for decades. Military academies will analyze the technical execution of Operation Absolute Resolve. Diplomatic institutions will study the unraveling of regional alliances. Economics departments will trace the accelerating collapse of dollar hegemony back to this moment when the United States abandoned all pretense of operating within rules. For China, the victory is not in Venezuela itself. It is in the validation of their worldview. It is in the demonstration that American partnership comes with strings attached to chains attached to bombs. It is in the quiet conversations occurring right now in capitals from Riyadh to Brasilia to Jakarta, where leaders are reconsidering their assumptions about who they can trust. The United States wanted to isolate Venezuela. Instead, by acting with such brazen disregard for international norms, they have isolated themselves. They have proven that strength without legitimacy is merely violence. They have shown that a nation willing to bomb its way to resources will eventually exhaust its supply of allies willing to look the other way. China does not need to fire a single shot. They simply need to wait and build and offer an alternative. They have spent 25 years constructing relationships across the Global South. They have invested in infrastructure while America invested in aircraft carriers. They have built bricks while America built sanctions regimes that pushed nations away. The petrodollar system that has sustained American financial supremacy since 1974 is not dying because of Chinese competition alone. It is dying because the United States has transformed its currency from a neutral medium of exchange into a political weapon, and now a literal weapon deployed against any nation that steps out of line. Every nation with oil, with minerals, with strategic resources is now recalculating their exposure to American power. They are asking whether dollar reserves can be frozen, whether their leaders can be indicted, whether their sovereignty means anything at all when American interests are at stake. The answers they are reaching will reshape the 21st century. And those answers favor Beijing. Observe the trade data in the coming months. Observe the currency agreements. Observe the gold purchases. Observe which nations begin pricing their exports in yuan or rupees or local currencies. Observe the M-Bridge platform expand. Observe BRICS grow. Do not observe the headlines about military operations and captured dictators. That is the spectacle they want you to see. Observe the bank vaults. Observe who is building the next financial system. Observe who is offering partnership without preconditions. The era of uncontested American dominance did not conclude on January 3, 2026. It has been concluding for years. But the operation in Venezuela will be remembered as the moment when the pretense finally collapsed. When the emperor ceased pretending he had clothes. When the rules-based international order was revealed as a mechanism of American control rather than universal principle. China comprehends this. The Global South comprehends this. The question is whether Americans comprehend what their government has done in their name and what it will cost them in the decades ahead. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve can be replenished. The refineries can be maintained. The oil can flow. But trust once destroyed does not return. Legitimacy once abandoned does not rebuild. And an empire that rules only through fear eventually discovers that fear is the least reliable foundation of power. The world is watching, and the world is drawing its conclusions. The old order is dying. The new order is being born. The only question is whether you will understand the world that is coming or be blindsided by it.